Okay, it's just gone 2 p.m. in UK. It's summertime, and the summer has come here. We're in the heat, which is very nice. My name is David Mills. I'm Centre for Global Higher Education Director, and it's a real pleasure to be welcoming Emily Dogbridge to this last in our series on the geopolitics of higher education. Um, and we've had some really interesting talks across a range of topics. They're all available on our website. But this is our last webinar, and Emily's title is Implications of Situated Solidarity Building for Rethinking the Geopolitics of Higher Education. Emily's a doctoral candidate at the Ontario Institute of Studies in Education, OISE, and I'm really looking forward to what I think is going to be a great conversation about researcher positionality, our positionalities, about the things we can do in our research to build solidarity with the communities we work with. And Emily, you work, I know, with the diasporic communities as well in Canada. So just before our handover, you will know that we record these, and we'll always put the webinar recording on tomorrow as soon as we can, and the slides will be available as well on our website. And as usual, we suggest you don't need your video on, but do use the chat function during the webinar to ask any questions or any comments you might have. You can watch the speaker in large view, and then after half an hour or so, we will go to Q&A. So Emily, it's a real pleasure to have you. This is the last of our CD webinars before we have a break for the summer. So last but definitely not least, it's going to be great. This is a wonderful way to end this webinar series. The screen's yours.
Great. Well, thank you so much, David, for that introduction. Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. It's such an honor for me to be here and be contributing to this webinar series. Just get my slides up there. All right. Yeah. So again, thank you so much, David and Lee, also for inviting me to participate in this webinar series on higher education geopolitics. So as David mentioned, I am coming to OISE at the University of Toronto. I'm a PhD candidate in the Department of Leadership, Higher and Adult Education. And I'll be speaking today about implications of situated solidarity building for rethinking the geopolitics of higher education. So looking at the blog post that was written on the event that happened in March, I was really excited to see that solidarity came up in some presentations. So I'm excited to kind of contribute and keep that conversation going. I saw that Entally talked about analyzing international statements and practices of solidarity, and Ahmed talked about building solidarity platforms and supporting scholars at risk. So by the end of my presentation today, I hope that you will see the immense potential of the concept of situated solidarity building to contribute to these conversations. For as universities are increasingly becoming entangled in geopolitics and being pressured by neoliberal agendas, rethinking our pedagogical approaches to expand what we do and the impact of our research for positive social and global change, I think has never been more pertinent and relevant. So my presentation today, I have three areas I'll be covering. So to begin with, I'll first be talking about defining what I mean by situated solidarities. I'll then look at why situated solidarities have relevance for higher education. And lastly, I'll be talking about how I use situated solidarity building in practice, using the example of my doctoral research to speak about that. So first, what do I mean by situated solidarities? So situated solidarities are a particular form of solidarity building and an approach to critical feminist scholarship and fieldwork. I discovered the concept in my feminist histories, methods and movements course early in my doctoral studies. And I've been really fascinated by this concept, and it's done a lot to help me explore and really think about my positionality as a researcher, and I think really expand the impact of my research. So situated solidarity building was first proposed, and the term was defined by Nagar and Nagar Geiger. And it emerged from the need to think about reflexivity, identity, and positionality to produce more politically transformative knowledge. It's a collaborative approach to doing feminist field work, I said, and the goal and a strategy for doing scholar activist work. So that means what ways can scholars bridge the divide between their academics and as well as doing activist work and really creating change on the ground in community. So the objective of situated solidarity building, one of the objectives is to reconfigure hegemonic models of knowledge production so that knowledge is not just reproduced for the benefit of the privileged, really thinking about who we're working with, what we're doing, why we're doing it, and how can we really listen to their concerns and elevate what they need in communities. So I share this quote by Nagar Geiger because I think it really captures what she's trying to convey with this concept of situated solidarity building and why it's significant, particularly in the geopolitics of higher education. So Nagar talks about the interconnection between globalization, the importance of challenging, colonizing, and dominant knowledges. She also refers to the connections between the global and the local, which you can see playing out in many different ways. And finally, the final section speaks to the importance of a situated understanding by emphasizing that our ability to, I quote, participate in processes of social change are significantly shaped by our geographical and socio-institutional locations. So what does situated solidarity building involve? So I'll talk about a couple of the different processes that underlie this concept and how we see it playing it out. So first off is the situated understanding at play. So that's thinking about and acknowledging the material, political, socioeconomic, cultural, and institutional conditions that have influenced the context in which the fields we work in takes place. By recognizing this, we can then recognize and work with and find ways to really give power back to our collaborators and by privileging local knowledges and wisdoms in place. Situated solidarity also involves recognizing that solidarity is not homogeneous, which means that solidarity is built through both critical convergences as well as divergences. That means looking for ways that we connect and we agree on certain things, or what's called partial synergies. So we find goals and aspirations that we can organize around or we agree upon, but it's also recognizing, acknowledging, and celebrating even those differences between us. Again, recognizing divergences, recognizing that we don't have to agree all on the exact same thing. Being reflexive and being a reflexive researcher is really important to this process. I'm sure you're going to talk about a lot more throughout. So reflexivity and situated solidarity building has multiple dimensions. This, of course, involves, again, being explicit in considering the economic, political, and institutional processes and structures that have shaped the research context and the encounters we have with collaborators and community. But it also involves what is called processual reflexivity, which implies recognizing that researchers can bring something of value to the research participants by sharing the knowledge and the resources that they've been afforded through their positions in academia. So this principle of reflexivity really drives home the point that positionality and reflexivity are not just about the researcher, but how important it is to understand the structural relationships that create the positionalities that are involved in building situated solidarity. And lastly, radical vulnerability, which Nagar has more recently written about in relation to the process of situated solidarity building, is a final but very important process. Radical vulnerability is needed for collaborative researcher because it really helps in building trust. And Nagar mentions it's really important to note that this vulnerability needs to be collectively embraced because it cannot be just about the researcher being vulnerable, but it's about the whole entire community building those relationships, that trust with each other. Before moving on to the significance of situated solidarity building for higher education, I wanted to briefly mention the 6 practices of situated solidarity building, which come from the work of Ruth and Derrickson, which is a more recent contribution to the concept. So they proposed there are 6 practices that they discovered through their work in the field as being influential in building situated solidarities. So first, this is being moved by the mission of the collective. Second is dispersing power. Third is resourcing potential. Fourth, resourcing solidarity. Fifth, challenging assumptions and norms. And lastly, but not least, is sustaining collaboration. So what benefit does situated solidarity building have for higher education? Well, first, in doing research through situated solidarity building can result in a demonstrated research impact and benefit for community. While we come from different places around the world, I'm sure many of us are familiar from applying for grants and funding, the increasing importance and relevance placed on demonstrated impact and making a difference in community. And so through using situated solidarities, researchers must engage with specific political struggles and critical dialogues that are important to people on the ground they're working with in the field. And this can help in conscious reasoning and impact factors for community. Stronger community-university partnerships and collective and collaborative international research is also possible through the processes of situated solidarity building. And then rethinking or dismantling barriers and binaries in terms of real world versus university, learning versus doing, or community versus classroom, which I'm sure many of us have heard in different contexts. For a long time, these spaces had been treated as sort of separate and distinct. But through separate situated solidarity building, we find ways that we can build bridges, cross boundaries, cross borders, to really connect these two different spaces and build something collectively and collaboratively, while having an on-the-ground real-world impact in the community. Next, situated solidarity building can help students and scholars improve their skills in reflexivity and elevate their place-based knowledge. Houston and Lang offer a really great example of this in a course that they developed and they write about, and how it supported global and local community engagement, and really helping students in their course really improve their understanding of place and connection with local community knowledge holders. Certainly a very important part in the process of building situated solidarity is the potential of this for disrupting knowledge hierarchies and geopolitics of knowledge production. Again, situated solidarity is about reconfiguring our fields and the production of knowledge towards the benefits of communities we are hoping to serve. And lastly, through these processes of situated solidarity building, we can improve the value of community-based work in academia, which again goes along with breaking down hierarchies of knowledge, academic knowledge and academic silos to create exciting and expanded possibilities for research and collaboration. So moving on, I will be talking about my doctoral research project. I'll be sharing with you some of the practices I used to build situated solidarities, and I'll be discussing some of the outcomes and my reflections on using these practices and the implications it's had for my research. So in my doctoral research project, I organized and facilitated a number of workshops in my community for newcomer women, in which I used situated solidarity building to explore issues pertaining to life as an immigrant in Canada, immigrants' knowledge of Indigenous peoples, and reconciliation in Canada, which are some really important political and situated issues we have. So the idea for this project really came through my own reflection and reflexivity about my positionality and my connection to land. I myself am not an immigrant, but I do come from an immigrant background, so consider myself a settler on these lands. And so thinking about, again, my positionality, my lifelong experiences growing up in an immigrant household, and what it means to really build connection with land and coming to new lands, and what it means to build community and connection in those spheres. I was really motivated to kind of reimagine what immigrant and diasporic learning experiences and community building could look like. So one of the objectives for my research project is simply to reflect upon the processes that support scholar activism and building situated solidarities. Data for this project comes from 3 sources. I did one-on-one semi-structured interviews of participants, both pre and post project, in order to determine the impact of this workshops. I also did my own reflexive embodied ethnographic fieldwork and reflections throughout the course of running this project. And lastly, as you'll see later in some of my processes and pedagogical methods, we did some journaling activities. And so I have some data as well from participant research journals. And so I've analyzed the content of this data through reflexive thematic analysis. So who participated in this project? I had 9 participants. They were coming from 4 different regions of the world, including Asia, South America, the Caribbean, and the Middle East. And they had been in Canada between 10 months and 3 years. That's consistent with the definition of a newcomer, which is someone who's been in this country for anywhere from 1 to 5 years. So the design of my workshops, I'll go through some of the processes that were involved in organizing these workshops and how they supported situated solidarity building. The design approach I took to developing the workshops followed a feminist collective organizing principles, and also involved respectively working with some Indigenous research methods and approaches for community engagement, which are really important for holding the researcher accountable to the research process and the research participants. In other words, this methods really helped encourage and enhance my reflexivity as a researcher in this project. I really wish to acknowledge support and guidance of my supervisor, Dr. Jennifer Wemigwans. She's an incredible researcher and scholar who specializes in the area of protecting and promoting Indigenous research methods, pedagogies, and knowledges. And her support and guidance has been invaluable to me in doing this work and engaging with some of these pedagogies and practices. So I've listed 4 different group activities that were involved in organizing the workshops. There were more that I could talk about in terms of collective, but in the interest of time and engagement of the audience, I'll be sticking with these 4. So every workshop began with what's called a check-in. So a check-in basically means we'd gather in a circle and we'd share how we were feeling, how we were doing in that moment, which is an opportunity to really open up to each other and build community and connection. So this practice was instrumental in encouraging radical vulnerability. As I mentioned before, Nagar talks about vulnerability in the space and how important it is to building trust and opening up and creating solidarity. And again, it's really important that that vulnerability be collectively embraced by the collective. So it's not just one individual. And so these group check-ins were a practice and pedagogy that really helped with building solidarity through radical vulnerability. Every section featured a reflective discussion or sharing circle, which I combined with the journaling activities. And so that was really important for thinking through some of these important topics and concepts. Every single session, I would bring in a different concept. I would introduce a different concept to the group. These would include or conclude such things as thinking about land, what our connection to land was, also thinking about reconciliation, what it meant to us, and how we saw ourselves in engaging in that process. Having the journaling combined with the reflective discussion was really great because it helped participants sort of reflect on their own, organize their thoughts, and then it helped them then be more prepared and ready to share again in that sharing circle. So sharing circles are really effective pedagogy for giving everybody voice. They're great also for distributing power amongst the collective and really acknowledging the value of everybody's situated knowledge and experience. Again, going around that circle, everybody had an opportunity to speak, share their perspectives, we listened with respect and intent. And it's also a great process and pedagogy for knowledge co-creation. So co-creating in that collective, sharing our knowledges and learning from each other. And in that sense, we can also see how this process and pedagogy helped with resourcing potential, which was also another point that Regent Derrickson mentioned as important for building situated solidarities. And so lastly, we had what's called a collective agreement. And so this was one activity I introduced early in our first couple of sessions. So basically how this went was we spent some time developing community guidelines or group values. So in this activity, our large group, I split us into smaller groups with 2 or 3 members, and we would collectively in those small groups brainstorm on some large paper, what we wanted to experience, how we wanted our learning space to be, how we wanted to feel, we wanted to get out of the experience together. And so after we spent some time on our individual groups brainstorming, we then came back together as a collective. We went around and shared our reflections. And this was a really fantastic activity to really see those situated solidarities start to form in practice. Because we could see in going around the groups that there were, again, those partial synergies, those points of convergence where shared values and shared goals were given between groups. So we saw some of the same values put forward, but we also, in going around the circle, were able to see some differences, and then really being inspired by everyone's different perspectives as well was also really generative. But I really felt the connection and the solidarity start to build in the group with that activity for certain. And even one of my participants in one of our post project interviews mentioned and reflected upon how this activity was really significant to her and sort of building that trust, knowing that she was in a safe space. So moving on, I'll discuss some of the outcomes and implications and some of my learnings from my findings in the research project. So first, one of the key themes that came out across interviews with participants at the end of the project was collective understanding that solidarity is not homogeneous. So everyone said it in a different way, but essentially it was to the effect that recognizing that we have commonalities and people were surprised by how many things we did have in common. Again, reflecting on that people came from so many different parts of the world, but also there was a great respect and excitement and celebration of our differences in culture and knowledge and experience. And learning about each other's differences as well through the process of the workshop was also really a point of interest and excitement for participants. It was really affirming to see how we were similar, but also to really exciting to learn about our different ways of viewing the world. So strong bonds of connection formed between participants, and this was really significant for helping build our intercultural community and connections. And reflecting on the project, I was actually really surprised, first of all, how fast connection came between participants, and also just how strong that intercultural community built. And even participants really also reflected on this in their interviews afterwards, saying they hadn't thought originally that, considering we were from so many different parts of the world, that we would have this kind of bond of connection, but there's something really special and a deep connection that really built throughout the project. Participants also commented on how they developed more confidence to speak and engage in discussion with others, and also talking about some of these critical issues in terms of land and Indigenous knowledges and respect for that. Practicing a deep listening, respect, and sharing feelings really encouraged and developed trust among everybody. As I mentioned, we had that process of checking in, and that was really significant for participants, again, to feel like they were being heard, their opinions and their perspectives and their situated knowledges were actually being valued, listened to, and respected. And so again, it helped build trust, but it also was very affirming in that sense. The recognition of the power of knowledge co-creation, limits of individual knowledge, was also something that came up. So again, every single discussion circle where we had that opportunity to share our perspectives, it was really great to see how everyone would come with their own perspectives and their own points, and we'd all collaborate in that co-creation of knowledge process. And that was really exciting to see what we were able to co-create together. And there was a sort of reflection and reflexivity in our post-project interviews that recognized that what we were able to create together, the collective output, as some people would say, was so much more, and we gained so much more from the experience and the learning process together than we ever could have based on what we individually do and brought to that sphere. And lastly, another one of the strongest themes was this greater appreciation for land, sense of connection to place, and respect for Indigenous peoples and knowledges. And across the board and in follow-up interviews, it was really clear that people had learned a lot and gained a lot, and the value of thinking about relationality and relationships to place and between different cultures had significant impact. And that again just leads into this idea of solidarity, building situated solidarities in place. So I did encounter some challenges, and this gives me reflection and thoughts on opportunities for future research. And these challenges I encountered are ongoing issues and debates that have come forth in fostering situated solidarities and are reflected in the literature. So there's this need for more time. Time is such an important factor, and there's different ways to think about this. So for instance, Houston and Lang talk about how finding the time to do this kind of work can be challenging, especially considering coming from academia and higher education, where we have so many different competing priorities and conflicts in our time. It definitely did take a lot of time to sort of organize and move together. And even that process of just finding a time for everybody to sort of meet in person, find a time where we could all get together and coordinate the sessions was a challenge in itself. Of course, the way things are nowadays, there are so many different priorities and happenings going on. And that was a challenge. There were some people who were interested in participating, but unfortunately, because some sessions were set at certain times, for the majority of people who were interested to begin with, they couldn't participate. Another interesting challenge I found related to time was the need for more time, because once people really started opening up and sharing from their perspectives, discussions really were very generative and flowed. And so I always found that I never wanted to cut things off because the conversation is sort of evolved. So in future opportunities and projects, just really being mindful of really making sure having that time and that space, and not necessarily being so bounded by time, but just again really trying to find opportunities to give that space and that discussion that needs to happen. Sustainability of projects is also an interesting challenge and really important point to make. The sustainability of collaboration was a point mentioned by Rich and Derrickson, of course, in their principles for situated solidarity building. And I think it's a really important one to consider, especially doing any kind of community engagement and work, is kind of what processes, what practices are in place for sustaining that collaboration and keeping things going, because it can be really generative, it can be really powerful, it can create that change, and again, how do we keep that going, that momentum building? I recognize that this being my PhD research project, it was kind of limited in the time and scope that of what I could do based on my time in the program. But definitely these two challenges or opportunities are important for consideration for future research projects. It's something I would definitely like to explore further. As I say, they are essential for doing community research, and especially considering what we have to work with in higher education, the demands on our time, as well as issues with lack of funding and underfunding. I think they're going to become more and more prevalent and important for research in the future. So this is some concluding thoughts. So situated solidarities, as I have argued, have enormous potential for building partnerships and fostering relationships between higher education and community with on-the-ground impact. This is one way I see universities and other institutions of higher education could function as geopolitical actors. Situated solidarity building offers a different and innovative way to build global networks and alliances that is flexible and adaptable. Again, because we're considering context and situatedness and relationships. It can really be adapted to different contexts and communities. I think there's a lot of potential in the ways it could be applied and used in research and community building. Reflexivity, situated understandings of context, and radical vulnerability are processes that I mentioned, which are important for building situated solidarities. But I think they also have significance for rethinking our practices and our pedagogies as scholars and researchers, and how we engage, especially in the geopolitics of higher education. And so lastly, I see the expanded opportunities for learning and more ways for building ethical knowledge sharing practices and the production of knowledge through these processes of situated solidarity, which can have direct impact on communities. There are my references. And lastly, thank you all for your time and attention. And I look forward to your questions. My contact information is on the screen, should you like to connect afterwards.
Brilliant, Emily, and thank you very much. Really interesting set of reflections on your research, and lots of ideas, lots of things to read. Why don't we start? I mean, before I open it to the questions, I mean, everyone, please, who'd like to ask questions, please do type in the chat. I mean, do you want to tell us a little bit more about the actual context in which you were doing this work? Could you describe, your participants a bit more, your interlocutors? Because even that first step of reaching out and building enough trust to get people to want to build solidarity is a form of solidarity building, isn't it? So tell us a bit about who you were working with and how you decided that it would work to bring them into these spaces, and so something about the pragmatics of who's in the room and how do you get them there, and how did that feel for you along the way, because that's all about care for you as well.
Absolutely. Thank you, David. That's a great question. Definitely building community. So I reached out first to some newcomer organizations in my community as that first step, and engaging with them. And I shared with them information about the project. I had a poster of my contact information. And so I explained to them what I was interested in doing. And I asked them if they would be okay with sharing that information with their communities. And they were really enthusiastic. They thought it was a great opportunity, a great program, again, for community building and solidarity work. And so they shared it with their networks. And so based on that, I had different people reaching out to join the project.
So just sorry to jump in. So tell us, are these organizations that are supporting diaspora communities? Are there particular organizations that you've been working with, and would they be doing their own solidarity building amongst themselves? As in, what do you add that they weren't doing already?
So they were organizations in the community. Yes, they were a newcomer community organizations. So helping with different, I was more sort of the pragmatics of being a newcomer and sort of what you need to do to get set up and sort of, finding places to live, finding work. So that's more of their focus. From my understanding, is what they focus on. They do some community building projects as well. But my project was definitely something that was different, and they recognized not being really in the community that they were familiar with. So there was a sort of novelty in that approach. And yeah, so there was a certain difference to that, for sure. And so yeah, again, like I said, they shared the information across their networks on some of their platforms. And based on that, I had the community come forward. There was a diversity in where people backgrounds came from. Some of them were working in the community. Some of them were international students. I had quite a few international students reach out and come to the project. And at the start, I was a little less than my target in terms of the number of participants I had. So I asked participants if they would be interested in inviting a friend or two. And so one of the participants was really invited some of her friends to join as well. So there was a little bit of snowball sampling as well in that process. So there was sort of, again, that can build trust too, right? When you share it with friends and colleagues. So based on kind of what that first session was able to build, I was able to build enough trust, at least in that first session. And of course, like I always had an initial call with participants to explain what the project was about, what we were doing, the focus. So I was very clear and open, answering any of their questions in terms of what we were going to do in the course of the research project and what it meant and what participation meant and looked like. So again, that the sort of initial sort of meeting with participants before the actual engagement in the process also helped build that connection, that trust, that relationship, and that solidarity. So it was definitely a sort of a striated approach. It didn't just start with coming to the workshop. There was a little bit of build up, as you rightly pointed out, for sure.
And how did you describe the project itself? Because the project, I mean, the situated solidarity was the process in some ways. It wasn't the project, was it?
Right, exactly. Yeah, no, it never really mentioned as sort of what we were doing for sure. Describing like a workshop series to build community, to learn, to have these discussions, these reflective discussions about, what it means to be a newcomer, like learning about Indigenous people's traditional knowledge. And that was something that participants were initially interested in learning more about. So that was a point of convergence that brought participants into the project, was having these discussions and learning, because some of them felt like they didn't really have much knowledge, but they were interested to learn more. And some of them had their own previous knowledge about Indigenous peoples from their homelands as well. So they also had that to bring in. They were also interested in sort of making that comparison between what they knew from their context and what was now what was here in Canada.
And so how did you bring in perspectives on Indigenous knowledge? Who was providing that voice, or was that you? How did you do that? Because that's tricky as well, isn't it?
Yes, very tricky, very tricky. It was based on my knowledge and what I've learned in terms of, again, working with my supervisor, my courses that I've taken through my faculty on Indigenous knowledge and research. And again, being open and honest that I'm still very, very new to this, like I have something to share. And so giving what I had from my perspective and what I've learned with participants, but again, always being open and giving them their self-determination in terms of going out and doing their own research and no knowledge building practices as well.
Interesting. Great. Good. I'll ask one last question before, please, anyone else who'd like to ask a question, do type it in the chat or raise your hand. But I've just you briefly touched on the challenges, and you said one of them was time and sustaining solidarities. I think both of those are connected in some ways, because solidarity work seems to me, and often we don't discuss enough, the sort of the way in which you can't remove yourself from relationships when research finishes. You actually are part of a set of dependencies and interdependencies that will carry on. How are you finding that now? And to what extent are you able to provide the support that people are looking for? And how do you know how much support to give, given all the other things you have to do at the same time?
For sure. Well, yeah, we still are connected for sure. Like you say, like those relationships you don't just drop off those relationships at the end. Absolutely. So again, being open, sharing things, we still have points of connection. We share resources with each other going forward. Again, conversations, if anybody reaches out for help or support, I'm always very open to those kinds of check-in and support and guidance given throughout.
Good. Would anyone else like to ask a question or comments? Please do come forward. Okay, so thank you, Yunpeng, for starting off. It's always a difficult one to be the first person to ask a question. So thank you very much for being brave. Would you like to unmute and ask a question personally about the activities? Okay, so Yunpeng says no
Sure.
mic. Okay, no problem at all, Yunpeng. So I'll read out what you wrote, and perhaps Emily can comment on it. So the question really is, a very thoughtful one, which is, can you tell us a bit more about what you did in the context of the activities to enact solidarity on the ground? Because they write, the method's findings seems to emphasize the researcher's interpretation of data. So yeah, so how do you juggle or balance your interpretation of what's going on with what people are telling you, and what that might mean for solidarities and solidarity building, really. Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah. So because of course that's always a dilemma, isn't it? That as a researcher, ultimately you will be providing your interpretation of this practice, and as you have done just now.
It's true, absolutely. Yeah, so definitely on the ground, I mean, having that open forum, as I discussed, that way of that sharing circle, really giving people their own um, opportunity to share from their own perspectives, and always prioritizing self-determination in the process and sharing what they want to share. I mean, giving suggestions as sort of like the organizer facilitator, but again, always leaving that open to participants' own interpretation, sharing what they felt was important to share. Also as well, of course, in the interview process, like again, saying that these are like having a semi-structured interview. I mean, had questions, but again, conversations would sort of continue on in different directions, and being open to, again, participants' interpretation, giving them really that self-determination over how they were responding. And in terms of like writing up final write-up of the findings, definitely consulting with participants as part of my research process, and making sure that what I'm writing my dissertation is approved by them, is what they feel is important, and giving them complete power and ownership over what it looks like in the findings.
So do you sense that you will be able to get them to read your findings? Have they asked to? Yeah.
Yes, oh, for sure. Oh, absolutely. It's part of my dissemination. Yes, fine. Reading the actual like write-up is for sure. And being open to, again, looking at various ways of connecting with them, whether it's reading, whether it's meeting, one-on-one to sort of talk about what's there, and sort of help with that understanding of and that collaboration, as well as providing sort of like, when the project is finished, providing like a sort of a one-pager or a write-up and findings, sort of to really, again, really conceptualize the whole entire project for everybody to really have that understanding, that connection, or that access to that knowledge.
I mean, obviously this is a webinar series on global higher education. How much in your sessions did you talk about people's experiences of education or access to higher education, or the feeling of being excluded from? I mean, was that a conversation that came back just in terms of this theme of geopolitics and solidarity?
Yeah, yeah. It was more, I think, a little bit more conversation shifted towards sort of like community experiences and knowledges about their experiences, and sort of like Indigenous peoples and knowledges from their own country and context.
Mhm.
But definitely there were some experiences and frustrations with sort of the system and of the immigration system in Canada, and some of those conversations that come up in terms of how it's different, and sort of that comparison between sort of what is known in sort of like educational spaces in homeland versus how it is different in this country, and sort of that tension there, and how things were not obviously not being the same, made it a little more challenging to sort of navigate and get through. So there's definitely some conversation about that.
Okay, interesting. A question from Emily about the method. Do you want to come up, unmute, Emily?
Sure. Excuse me. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah, I just wondered how, like, did you start with sort of like, I want to learn about situated solidarities, or did you start with, I want to practice community building among newcomers to Canada? Like, how did it all sort of come about? And like, I can sort of imagine other applications, but maybe could you tell us some other applications from the literature? Because this is new to me.
Absolutely, for sure. So yeah, I did start off thinking about who I wanted to work with, and sort of the project, and then learning about the process of situated solidarity building, I think, because I was interested in building community connections, sort of like working across borders and creating that community connection with people from different diasporic backgrounds, and just seeing this methodology, I thought it could really sort of fit into that sort of overall goal objective for what I was hoping to sort of experience and learn through the process of this project in terms of, again, building that solidarity across difference and diversity. So that's kind of how I found that, sort of stumbled upon the method, and then just reading more about that method, was interested in sort of learning more about that. So again, to your point, it's sort of the latter that you mentioned about working with different diasporic communities.
Okay, does that answer your question, Emily?
Yeah, I guess I just
Oh, applications. Apologies, I missed that one. Yes.
Sure.
Yeah, for sure. There was a couple of different papers. One was by Religion Derrickson, which worked with Bangladeshi farmers in that context. And then there was the other paper by Houston and Lang, which looked at a particular learning project a college learning project for students working with community knowledge keepers and sort of building those connections across those different. So I think definitely there's a lot of different applications, different communities that these spaces could work with. I haven't really can think of any off the top of my head, but I think again, because it's about building sort of these connections across diverse communities and is sort of flexible and adaptable, there could be many different opportunities for application.
Very cool. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Emily. That was helpful to think about the context and the possible uses of it. One question from Adriana. Would you like to ask this? It's about really
Yes.
how clear you can be about what you're trying to do with your participants.
Yeah. Thank you. Hi, Emily. How are you?
I'm great. How are you?
Thank you for your presentation. I'm very removed from this kind of research, so it's been difficult to actually grasp it during your presentation. I understand like a lot of the method from your explanation. I just was a little bit lost because I was not understanding like who are the participants, like who are these people. So I guess it's all students or not, or I thought at first that it was administrators or other kind of people, but I think it's the students. I don't know. You can clarify for me. And then how do you choose the students? I think that there was like you have something about newcomers with a maximum of, or I don't know if that was your criteria or that was the pool of participants you gather. And like really, what is the objective to work with them? Is for them to learn this practice, or what is like I'm a little bit lost. And so if you could just for one more time, please just clarify that part. Thank you.
For sure, Adriana. Yeah, no, they weren't all students. Basically, my participants were newcomer women in the community. So a newcomer, anybody who'd been within the community from up to 5 years is sort of considered a newcomer. So it's a pretty open to anyone who was a newcomer woman to the community. Was basically my criteria for who was interested in participating.
So just to stop in community,
yeah.
Was that place-based, your definition? How did you define community there?
Yes, within sort of the city. Yeah, okay. Yes, the city that I was working in. And so, yeah, as long as they were interested in being part of the project, and sort of they were new to the community, they were interested in sort of learning and having these discussions. And again, having gone through sort of like the initial touch point sort of screening, as well as the initial interviews, they were invited into and participated in the project. And then the goals of the research, again, it was building solidarity and building community and connection, sort of building that space for people who are new to the community to connect, learn from each other, and have these kinds of conversations and these reflective discussions. And sort of the objective was to build so again, being in the space of adult education and community development, there were two kind of objectives, and that was one, of course, the adult learning, and how can we kind of learn about place, how can we sort of learn about and think about our relationship to place and these different situated factors and how we are involved. And then also that community building aspect of how we can build connections, and especially looking at how we can build connections across sort of people coming from diverse backgrounds, and how we can sort of build that solidarity.
Oh, thank you. That's very helpful, and that actually I think is quite, well, for my experience, innovative. And I can see how it really can benefit like themselves as newcomers, and obviously that can like multiply, with the community. So yeah, thank you for that. I think I'm more clear now. Thank you, Emily.
Absolutely, glad to hear it. Thank you for the question.
It's certainly a form of sort of action research, isn't it? Where the goal is not particularly primarily your research projects, but it's actually thinking more broadly about how that plays out in the community more broadly. So we have a couple of questions before we finish. Georgia and Jonah. Georgia, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, sure. Sorry, I didn't mean to turn my video on. That was not intentional.
No problem. No problem.
But hi, Emily. So, like I said in the question, I'm a UT alum. Have been policy all the time. I'm an immigrant to Toronto. How you navigated the spatial politics of Toronto as such an immigrant-heavy city, and because it has different pockets, and whether like language were a barrier as well, and how you foster solidarity within the actual city of Toronto, given that there's such, as Canada likes to call it, multicultural city. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thanks.
Great.
Thanks. You were breaking up slightly, but I think we heard most of the question, which was about, for you, Emily, was about navigating, I think, the language politics as well as the spatial politics of the city, and how that links to place. So yeah, a great question, George. Thank you.
Great. Yeah, thank you, Georgia. It's great to meet you. Yeah, I know, definitely. In terms of the project, that was something I had considered for sure, and who was going to come into that space. Again, if people would be able to, just language politics, like who, if English was maybe not going to be something that people could communicate through. But in terms of who came in, though a lot of my participants, English was a second language, they were able to communicate through English throughout the sessions. So we never had any issues with that kind of barrier in language. And it does sort of kind of maybe question sort of future iterations and research, again, how that might have played in, if that had been. I was prepared in different scenarios in terms of if we need to, I need to have some sort of like a translator, or if we could use some sort of technology that could bring their own, translation sort of devices or software in terms of how they wanted to engage and how we could communicate, since that was the only kind of language that we could connect through. So I was prepared with sort of strategies to navigate that. I never had to actually enact that because everybody came in and was comfortable enough with the language. And that's one thing also that the journaling practice also helped with as well, in terms of being able to organize thoughts and be able to communicate with the group. So that was sort of a practice that helped sort of build that solidarity and people being able to interact and connect as well.
Good. Okay. Thank you. And a last question perhaps for today. Jonah, which is a very really sensible question about what does this all mean for researchers and administrators. Jonah.
Hi. Yeah, thank you so much for the presentation, Emily. That essentially touches on it. I was wondering if you could kind of give us a little bit of your insights into how this might produce implications for researchers or administrators that are thinking about more broadly about what this type of collective solidarity might mean in a geopolitical sense, either for higher education more broadly or for individual institutions existing in their communities. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no, thank you, Jonah. That's a fantastic question. Yeah, it's definitely something I've been thinking about sort of, again, because this project was very sort of local and situated in the very smaller sort of, first time I experienced doing this kind of work. But I definitely think there's some really great applications and opportunities for researcher administrators and their roles. It comes down, I think, a lot to relationship building and that reflexivity, which is so critical in terms of how we engage, sort of in broader politics and how we're showing up, and then really thinking about kind of the different systems and structures and production of knowledge and hierarchies. And really, again, it really helps us rethink our roles and really find ways. I think you think about ways that we can sort of branch out and build more, transformative relationships and create learning that is, more engaged, connected, and really bringing in diverse pedagogies and knowledges to really expand our opportunities and our impact in what we do. Yeah, more broadly.
So it sort of sounds like it helps us think through the practice of reflexivity, not just in research but in other things as well. Because yes, I mean, in some ways what we're describing is good diplomacy and relationship building. Absolutely.
Yeah, and the idea of relationality, I think, is so central as well, that in terms of thinking about all the different relationships we are involved in and how different relationships affect one another. I think it really can help create more critical and insightful awareness.
Yeah. So we actually have another great question that's come in, which is from Vesna. Do you want to ask a question, Vesna? Hi, welcome.
Yes, thank you. Hi, Emily. Nice to see you
Hey,
again.
Vesna, you too.
We had the opportunity to talk a lot about your research recently, so I'm not going to ask again about the project itself, but I was actually intrigued by a note you made in relation to the situated solidarity building projects in general. And you mentioned something that was quite interesting, that there is a kind of potential for it to somehow open up the spaces, academic spaces for different kinds of knowledges, and in those terms kind of rethink what is important in academia and how can we serve better our participants or kind of communities we are aiming to serve. So that was an interesting note as something that this concept and these ideas can kind of bring further into our work as researchers, as scholars, and as teachers as well, right? So could you kind of reflect a little bit more on this? What is your thinking about it, and also what is your learning from it? How does your academic community accept this project, and is it recognized as valid research and things like that? So thanks again.
Thanks, Vesna. That's a really good question. Yes, I definitely think it has the potential, as you mentioned, for all of that. I think it's been the concept of situated solidarities in terms of my review of the literature, finding it's been challenging to find sort of evidence of like different projects using this. I think maybe because the methodology itself is not so well researched, there's a lot of opportunity, I think, for applying it. But in terms of my experience, it was really interesting from my perspective as a researcher to really go into to be part of that space and that solidarity building. And I think it helps create a real deep connection between researcher and community, and also, again, that really reflectiveness sort of in terms of responsibility, in terms of responsibility to community, and that sort of that situatedness, I think, is a big dimension in terms of really grounding the work we do and really having that on the ground impact, like I said. And I think that has a significant amount of possible benefits in terms of building connections, building relationships, which it really comes back to in a sense, which I think can be transformed in terms of what we do, how we do it, and again, the impact that we have in terms of like ethics and community building.
Is there a tension there, Vesna and Emily, between your career and the things for you personally, where you go, and the larger project of solidarity building? Can you keep those in do they not pull different directions sometimes?
Yeah, I think they do. Yeah, and it's learning to balance those tensions and navigate those tensions. But again, sort of having that experience and engaging the process, I think, helps you learn to understand sort of the value of both different spheres, and sort of learn to really struggle and fight for keeping those connections and those bonds of solidarity going forward.
Good. Okay. Emily, thank you very much. It's a really interesting set of reflections you've given us, and I think you've left us all thinking about how we balance, our own expectations or plans or careers with this larger picture of what we can do within higher education to build community, to build relationships, even with our students and even with our peers, but also as you've done, across divides, differences of nationality and language. So thank you very much, Emily. It's a great thing for us to end our summer series with. Thank you again for everyone coming. We will now have a break for a month to give you all a chance to recover and have a bit of a rest. And we will start again in September, on the first Tuesday of September, which is September the 3rd. And we have Ben Mulvey, who's going to be talking about African students in China. So please do join us. And if you'd like to give a webinar, please do get in touch. And we're always keen to hear from people who would like to put full papers forward. So thank you again. We're going to end now. Well done, Emily. It was a great talk.
Great. Thank you, David. Thank you, everybody.
Pleasure. Bye-bye.